Hello and good morning or good afternoon if you're joining us from the UK. We have a great presentation ahead of us for today's webinar, The Path to Brexit Updates and What Happens Next. Before we get into the heart of the presentation, just want to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to download the recording tomorrow. In that follow-up email, you will also receive a link to download the slide deck as well as continuing education credits. Additionally, if you have a question throughout today's presentation, please feel free to ask it. You can do so by typing it into the GoToWebinar chat function that you should see somewhere on your screen. For those that are unfamiliar with Envoy, Envoy has been on a mission to fix the inefficient, frustrating, and confusing immigration process. Envoy combines expert legal representation with innovative technology to deliver the only platform that makes it seamless for companies to hire, mobilize, and manage a global workforce. Envoy secures work authorization in over 150 countries, has grown 41% year over year, and works with over 1,000 customers. We are particularly proud of our NPS score, which is a testament to the employee experience that we provide. And introducing today's main presenter, please welcome Hannah Inchan. Hannah is a Global Immigration Manager for EMEA here at Envoy Global. Hannah has over 15 years of immigration experience, and in her current role provides strategic and holistic guidance to Envoy's customers and works closely with them to execute multi-regional moves. Hannah is also a registered solicitor of England and Wales. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us this evening for you, but morning over here in Chicago.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So before I turn things over to Hannah and we look at the deck that we've put together, just want to provide a brief agenda of just some of the main topics that we'll be discussing today. If you take a look at our screen here, just I'm going to rattle some off. Timeline of Brexit. We have a great visual timeline that was a couple slides away, and then kind of examine what if there is a no deal, what if there is a deal, and then go from there. So finally, just a quick reminder that the content in this presentation, it is not intended as legal advice. If you have additional questions, please consult with an Envoy affiliated attorney or another qualified professional. So we just got a couple quick questions. Again, just as a reminder, this presentation will be available to download once it is uploaded to our website. So that should be later today or tomorrow. So you'll be notified when that occurs. Okay, so Hannah, let's dive into it and look at an overall timeline of Brexit. And here we started in 2015 and then go throughout the years. And Hannah, kind of obviously Brexit's been in the news a lot. There's been a lot of big developments this week. And I just want to ask you a question to start things off. As we take a look, starting in 2015, you see that then Prime Minister David Cameron wins his re-election, and one of his key promises was a referendum on the UK's membership of the EU. Hannah, why did David Cameron make that promise to hold a referendum?
Well, back in 2015, the sort of question of whether the UK's membership to the EU was becoming more of a contentious issue, because as part of our membership to the EU, we have to pay or make certain financial contributions. And given the sort of economic situation we were in at the time, there were a lot of sort of feeling that we shouldn't be making such huge financial contributions to the EU. What benefits are we getting from the membership? And a lot of people believe that David Cameron made the promise, one, to win the election, and two, he didn't think that anyone would actually vote for Brexit. So that's why he thought it was an easy win for him and for his party. And that was one theory, is that was why he made that promise.
Interesting. So, and then that's what happens after 2015 as we kind of move along the timeline. What June 2016, the referendum happened. Can you walk us through some of these other highlights that we're looking at?
Yeah, so in 2016, June 2015, the referendum was held. 51.9% of UK voters voted to leave the EU. The following day, David Cameron resigned, and about a month later, Theresa May was announced as the new Prime Minister. The Brexit process was formally started with the triggering of Article 50 in March 2017. And that date, March 2017, led to 2 years for the Brexit process to be completed. So, which is why we have the date March 29th, 2019, as being the initial Brexit date. So during this whole time, Theresa May negotiated with the EU to form an agreement, and an official withdrawal agreement was released in November 2018, ready for discussions, ready for debating in Parliament, and ready to be agreed, pass as UK law, and ready for 29th of March 2019, when the UK would formally leave the EU. During that whole time, the UK Home Office have been preparing to leave the EU, and what they did was they actually implemented what we call the UK settlement scheme, which we'll talk about a bit later. The UK settlement scheme was implemented in January 2019, and so, but March 29th of March 2019 came. The UK Parliament wouldn't agree to the deal that Theresa May had negotiated, so an extension was granted until the 31st of October 2019, which is next week. But following the extension, Theresa May resigned as Prime Minister, and then on 24th of July, Boris Johnson was appointed as our new Prime Minister, which is where we are now. So
speaking of where we are now, let's move on. Let's discuss some of the latest developments as we move on to this next slide. Some of these, as I mentioned, last week, beginning of October, a lot of big developments. So let's start out on October 4th. What happens at the beginning of October?
So what happened? Boris Johnson has he's put together a deal, and he submitted his Brexit proposal deal to the EU. One of the biggest sticking points in any of these deals, and getting any of these deals passed, was what has been coined the Irish backstop. This is the question of how to deal with the border between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland. Everyone agrees that we shouldn't avoid creating a physical border between the two countries, but the question remains, how do we resolve the customs issue between the two countries? So Boris's deal proposes that in one way to deal with the customs issue is to have an online customs declaration, which will be submitted prior to crossing the border between the two countries. He also proposed that customs checks be held in locations in both countries, but not at the border. So his proposal has tried to address some of these questions. And moving on to the 17th of October, when the EU held a summit, Boris and the EU announced that they actually agreed to the deal that Boris proposed. But then following the 17th of October, Boris brings the deal back to the UK, and the UK Parliament vote on the deal. But instead of actually voting to either accept or reject the deal, what happened was one MP, one Minister of Parliament, Oliver Letwin, proposed that they actually amend the proposal, which stated that they would be holding off giving the final approval for the UK-EU deal until detailed legislation, which will be known as the Withdrawal Agreement, is passed in the UK. So effectively, that means that the deal will not be approved or voted on until they've actually agreed the law that would form the basis of that deal. But having with any law with the UK, it has to go through both houses. So both the House of Commons and also has to be passed at the House of Lords. So what that means effectively is we're going to have to delay Brexit, or potentially delay Brexit. So the following day, Boris Johnson sends a letter to the EU requesting an extension to the 31st of January 2020, as he is required to do so by law. But with Boris being the character that he is, he also sent the letter that he sent requesting the extension was unsigned. He didn't personally sign it. Instead, what he did was he sent a second letter to the EU, confirming, well, indicating that the first letter was not of his opinion. He didn't want to do that. He will actually press on with efforts to pass the Brexit deal internally. And it was his personal opinion that the EU should not approve an extension. So we're moving on to the 21st of October. And promising, following upon his promise to try and push the EU deal withdrawal agreement through, the UK government published the withdrawal agreement bill. This bill details the terms for the legislation for the UK to withdraw from the EU. The UK government provided a timetable of 3 days to review, debate, and then vote on the bill, and then subsequently vote on the deal. But the following day, the 22nd of October, the UK Parliament voted they voted in theory for the deal, but they voted against the government's timetable to vote on the bill. So they've effectively, what they've said is, we will not be introducing the new law by the 31st of October. Where does that leave us now? Effectively, that means that we are waiting for the EU to confirm or deny the extension. That is hopefully going to happen tomorrow. There's been indications that there is a lot of support for an extension to the EU, for an extension to Brexit within the EU, but we know that the French President Macron isn't in favour of an extension. So we will wait to hear tomorrow.
Hannah, so you just mentioned that the French President Emmanuel Macron is not in favor. Is there any reason why?
Well, there's indications that, the news reports indicate that the reason why he's not in favour is because if the EU grant an extension to the UK, it will simply mean the UK will procrastinate. They will, like they did with March and April, May, with those extensions then, and even with October, nothing's happened in terms of getting a deal or in terms of getting a withdrawal agreement bill passed until the very last minute. Like we're seeing here, we've not seen any real movement in terms of getting a deal passed within Parliament until the last week. And that's what Macron's point is that if they let the EU extend the deadline, then we will simply keep bubbling along until the very last minute, probably in January, and then right at the last minute in January, we will ask for another extension. And that's what his fear is. So in terms of granting the extension, we will have to wait until tomorrow to find out.
Interesting. Any idea on when that, like time-wise, that announcement may come out?
It's difficult to say. So far, most of the news releases have been coming out in the afternoon, sort of around 1, 2, 3 p.m. So that UK time. So that's probably when we would expect to hear something, is around sort of afternoon time tomorrow. So I want to be watching the news.
Yeah, exactly. So Hannah, before we move on to examine the two potential outcomes of whether there's no deal or there is a deal, we actually just got an interesting question. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you think there's any chance of a second referendum?
Possibly. There has been talks about referendums. There's been two types of referendums. One, a confirmation referendum, as in, do we want to continue with the Brexit process? And the other one is a similar thing, is another Brexit referendum, slightly different, but effectively saying the same thing. I think it's unlikely that we will have a referendum because there's been a lot of opposition, and effectively another referendum would negate the first one. So a lot of feeling is, why bother with the first one? The people have spoken during the first referendum because it was a purely a vote. It was a representative vote. So every vote was counted in the referendum, and the people have spoken, and that's the decision the people have made. So there's a lot of feeling against another referendum. But Boris has indicated that if the EU does grant an extension, he will call an election. Whether that election will happen is unsure. There's a lot of news reports about where the government are going if there's an extension, but it's very much a wait and see over the next week. So we may still leave on the 31st of October if the EU don't grant the extension, but if they do, we could be looking at the 31st of January 2020.
So let's examine those situations, starting with because we have this new section. What if there is no deal? Hannah, what happens if there is no deal?
So what will happen if there is no deal and the EU don't grant an extension? Then on the 1st of November, free movements for EU citizens will end. They will be entered as visitors. They won't be entered as part of settled or part of the labour force. EA nationals and their families who arrive in the UK before the deadline can apply for the EU settlement scheme. So if they arrive if we are going to be leaving the EU on the 31st of October, then all EA nationals and their families who arrive before that date could apply under the EU settlement scheme. But any EA nationals and their family members who arrive on the 1st of November, and if there is no deal, they will need to apply for an alternative permit called the European Leave to Remain permit if they wish to stay in the UK for more than 3 months. We'll go into a bit further into more detail on both schemes sort of later, but that's effectively what will happen. EU free movement of rights, EU free movement will end for EA nationals. Just moving on, there could be some very general changes that we could see if they're in a no Brexit situation. The UK government has announced that they will proactively be keeping out or deporting more EU nationals who commit crimes in the UK. They'll also be removing the blue EU customs channel. Because at the moment there's a green customs channel, a blue customs channel, and a red customs channel. The blue one will be gone. The UK nationals who reside in another EA country will need to comply with UK rules when they want to bring family members to the UK. So, for example, if we have a UK national who resides in the Netherlands with his US wife, under the current rules, the US national, so the wife, could get an EA card and in the Netherlands, and then come and utilize that permit in the UK. She would be using her spouse's free movement of rights to come and work and live in the UK. However, under the new rules, in a no deal Brexit, that spouse would have to comply under UK immigration rules. So generally, the UK immigration process will be a lot longer, is a lot more stringent, and a lot more requirements. We could also see UK blue passports returning to the UK as early as beginning of 2020. So those are just a few general things that we could be seeing.
Mm-hmm. And let's shift gears. And Hannah, can you describe or discuss what if there is a deal?
So if there is a deal, then the free movement rules for EA nationals will be extended to 31st of December 2020 instead of the date of Brexit, so 31st of October 2019 in a no deal scenario. In a no deal scenario, EA nationals have to be in the UK before Brexit in order to qualify for the EU settlement scheme. If there is a deal scenario, then EA nationals can have free movement and they could be eligible for the EU settlement scheme anytime up until the 31st of December 2020. The transition period to apply under the EU settlement scheme is extended until the 30th of June 2021. So the EU national will need to be in the UK by the 31st of December 2020, but they have up until the 30th of June 2021 to apply for the settlement scheme. And it also it keeps the rules for EU family members open up until those deadlines as well. So with a deal situation, the wider definition of an EA family member will remain in place, and they could also be eligible for the EU settlement scheme. However, in a no deal situation, that definition of the family members will exclude a number of family members, for example, the grandparent of the spouse, which under the current rules, under EU rules, could be eligible for a permit, but in a no deal situation, that grandparent won't be eligible for a permit.
Gotcha. So Hannah, moving on, I want to discuss Irish nationals. They have a special status in the UK, don't they?
Yes, they do. Under the Ireland Act 1949, the Republic of Ireland is not treated as a foreign country. So Irish nationals have the same rights as UK nationals. They can move freely within the UK. They can live, they can work without needing an additional permit. But the benefit or the advantage of being an Irish national is that they can utilise either the UK immigration rules if they chose to, or they could actually utilise the EU immigration rules, so EU free movement for their family members, which does have a lot of benefits as well. So they can pick and choose as they wish. But for family members, Irish nationals can pick and choose whichever routes they wish to use. As I mentioned earlier, the UK immigration rules can be a lengthier process with a lot more requirements, whereas if they chose to utilise the EU process, then their EA family members, they would include a wider number of family members, and also it could be a faster process for them to come to the UK.
Gotcha. Thank you for elaborating on that. Moving on, Hannah, you mentioned earlier that you're going to discuss the EU settlement scheme. So as we come upon this, what can you tell us about the EU settlement scheme?
So the EU settlement scheme was introduced in January 2019, and it's open to EU and EFTA, so EU and nationals under the EFTA, the European Foreign Trade Agreement, jointly known as the EA nationals. And in the UK, so anyone EA nationals coming to the UK before Brexit will have up until in a deal situation, they'll have up until 31st of December 2020 in order to come to the UK, and they'll have up until June 2021 to apply. So what does that mean? That means that they can include their family members of EA nationals. And I mentioned earlier that family members under EU rules are quite extensive. So they would include individuals or family members such as a spouse, civil partner, or unmarried partner. If it could include family members who are related to an EU, EA, or Swiss national, or their spouse, or their civil partner, as either the child, grandchild, or great-grandchild under the age of 21, a dependent child over the age of 21, a dependent parent, grandparent, or great-grandparent, a dependent relative, so potentially an aunt or an uncle, and or someone who's lived with the UK national outside the UK and is either married or in a civil relationship with the individual. So I gave an example earlier, and here's another example. It's possible for a Spanish national who has a Mexican civil partner that they could bring the partner's dependent grandparent, who may also be a Mexican national, to come and reside with them in the UK. Under UK immigration rules, that wouldn't be allowed. So the application fee, there is none. The application is free. The process can be quite simple. For an EA national, you can have an app on your phone. You would be able to scan your documents and upload it via the app. The app's available, I believe, on both iPlayer, iPhone, and also on Android phones. But for non-EA nationals, they have to submit their application by post and to the EU settlement scheme team. The team will aim to send documents back within 3 working days of receipt, but you do have to send your original documents, so your original passports, etc.
So Hannah, when you say documents, what kind of documents or information will they need to submit?
So what will happen is the Home Office will check the length of residency in the UK. So this can be done by checking the national insurance number. But if you don't have a national insurance number, or you can't, or if the Home Office can't complete the check using the national insurance number, they will be asking for documents such as your bank statements, council tax bills, utility bills to show your residency and the length of residency. The Home Office will also check for criminal convictions. So if minor criminal convictions don't automatically make the individual ineligible, but each case will be decided on a case-by-case basis. But just bearing in mind that Boris Johnson has announced that they will be clamping down on individuals who have committed crimes in the UK. So if they have had any criminal convictions or charges, documents evidencing those, evidencing what the charge was, etc., would also be needed. So just to sort of move on into what would you get once you've submitted the application. The EU settlement team will determine whether the individual qualifies for settled status. What does settled status mean? It's also known as permanent residence. So to gain settled status, the individual will need to have completed 5 years continuous residence in the UK and have not been outside the UK for at least 6 months in any 12-month period. There are exceptions to this rule. For example, if someone's recently had a child and wanted to go and spend time, back home or abroad, that may be an exception, or an individual has been sent to work overseas for an assignment, but it's always best to double check with your immigration advisor whether your absence from the UK could make you ineligible for settled status. If you don't get settled status, you will be granted with pre-settled status. Pre-settled status can lead to permanent residence, so it can lead to settled status. But once you've completed the 5 years, then you would apply for settled status and then potentially be granted. The deadline, as mentioned earlier, the deadline to submit your EU settlement scheme application will depend on whether we have a deal or not. So it would either be the 31st of December 2020, or it could be the 30th of June 2021.
Gotcha. So moving along, next section we have up to discuss our EU nationals in a no deal post-Brexit. So Hannah, what can you discuss for this section as we move on to this slide here?
So for EU nationals who are coming to the UK after Brexit in a no deal situation, they could potentially apply for what's called a European temporary leave to remain permit. So if Brexit happens on the 31st of October, EU national comes to the UK on the 1st of November, and they're looking to reside in the UK and work in the UK for more than 3 months, then they would apply for this permit. We don't have any real details on this scheme yet. It will be open after Brexit, but I believe the reason they haven't implemented or provided more details on the scheme is because we don't know if we will be in the situation where the scheme is needed. Hopefully there will be a deal agreed and passed through Parliament and in law. So potentially we may not need to implement the European temporary leave to remain permit. But if we do, it will be open after Brexit, and it will only be available in a no-deal Brexit situation. Like with the EU settlement scheme, there are no fees payable. The application is submitted after the individual's arrived in the UK, and the deadline to apply is going to be the 31st of December 2020. If no application for the European leave to remain permit has been made by this point, then the individual will need to leave the UK by the 31st of December 2020. The European leave to remain permit does not lead to permanent residence. So unlike the EU settlement scheme, which does eventually could lead to settlement, this permit does not. But what the UK Home Office have indicated is that if the individual has got the European leave to remain permit, but subsequently obtains a permit that does lead to permanent residence, then time spent in the UK under the European leave to remain scheme can be included in the residence requirement for permanent residence. So, for example, if a French national moved to the UK in November 2019 in a post no deal Brexit situation, she then applies for a European temporary leave to remain permit, but then in January 2021, she applies for a new permit under the new scheme, under the new immigration process. Then the time spent from November from November 2019 will be counted towards any permanent residence residency requirement that will be implemented. And so potentially it could be beneficial.
Hannah, I have a question for you. What can the EU national do if he or she wants to stay in the UK after December 31st, 2020?
So in the situation where the EU national wanted to stay, if they've arrived post-Brexit with a no-deal situation, the UK government have announced a proposal to implement an Australian-style points-based system immigration process from January 2021. So EA nationals could apply for a permit under the new points-based system. And like I mentioned just now, that if they have a new permit from January 2021 and they have the European Leave to Remain permit, that time spent could be counted towards any residence requirement for permanent residency.
And do you have any a sense of when more details on the new immigration process may be released?
When the last overhaul of the UK immigration system happened, that was back in 2008, when the current points-based system was implemented. There was a lot of public consultation, and also we were given an idea of the requirements and the process a few months before date of implementation. So we would expect to see a similar sort of time frame with any new overhaul of the system. So the current system has been in place since 2008. There's been a lot of changes and a lot of movement with the current system, but the government are looking to completely overhaul it. So we could see a lot of changes over the next few years, not just with Brexit, but also in January 2021, with a completely new immigration process for non-EA nationals as well as EA nationals. But just sort of moving on to looking at, what would happen with non-EA family members under this, the European Leave to Remain process. As I mentioned earlier, that it's a lot more restrictive. There are two types of non-EA family rights: close family members and non-close family members. Close family members are considered spouses or partners and dependent children under the age of 18. Non-extended family members are considered children under the age of 18, under the age of 21, or over the age of 21, where they're dependent of an EA national or their partner. They are a dependent parent or grandparent of an EA national or their partner. But the difference will be in that the close family members will be able to apply for the European Leave to Remain permit once the EA national has it. But if you have a non-EA family member who is part of the extended group, they can come and enter the UK and remain until 31st of December, but they will have to leave as of the 31st of December 2020. They won't be able to remain any longer than that. And also they would, both sets of family members will need to apply for an EA family permit prior to coming to the UK. So those are for non-EA nationals who are family members of an EA national.
So Hannah, this is a ton of great information. As we near the end of the presentation, my question for you is, what tips do you suggest companies do now?
That's a good question. What I would suggest is that companies check in with your EA nationals and any employed family members. check whether they've applied for their EU settlement scheme or not. And if they haven't done so, then request that they do so soon. They do have until the 31st of December 2020 to apply, but the sooner they apply, the better. I would also encourage employers to check their right to work processes. Companies should have a right to work process, checking process in place. And this would include EA nationals coming to the UK, and I would urge them to, check their processes, make sure they are robust processes, and also look at implementing a process to check your EA nationals who are coming to the UK post Brexit, and to require them to apply for either the EU settlement scheme if we have a deal situation, or apply for the European Leave to Remain scheme if we have a no deal situation.
Gotcha. So, Hannah, we have an idea of what will happen to EU nationals in the UK, but curious to hear, what about UK nationals in other EU countries?
So the whole of Europe are very conscious about Brexit, and looking at, there are a number of EEA nationals in the UK, but there are also hundreds of thousands of UK nationals in various countries around Europe. I'll quickly go through a couple of situations. So France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Spain. Each country has a very different level of preparation for Brexit. For example, in France, the French authorities have indicated that there will be a registration process post-Brexit, but if there's a deal, then that registration process will be extended up until 31st of December 2020. But for UK nationals who will be relocating to France after Brexit, then what will happen potentially in a no-deal situation, they will need to obtain a full work permit and a full work residence permit. And knowing the French process as we do, that can be quite a lengthy process, especially if you're applying during the summer period, where a lot of government employees go on holiday throughout the whole of August. So best time of year to avoid is around the summer period, where sometimes it feels like the whole of France is on holiday. But just skipping over to Germany, so UK nationals residing in Germany before Brexit are required to register their address if they're residing there for more than 3 months. They register their address with the local registry office, just like every other EU national. So following Brexit, UK nationals will need to obtain a residence permit. And if the UK national has already registered their address with the local registry office, this will make the residence permit application a lot smoother. The German government are looking to implement a 3-month transition period for post-Brexit, but there have been indications that the transition period could be extended. And UK nationals relocating to Germany after Brexit will need to obtain a work permit, a work visa. There is a special category of German work visas where you can apply primarily on the basis of your nationality. The UK nationals will be part of that special nationality work visa. So they would join countries such as the USA and Australia, and they're called the privileged nationals. It's called the privileged national work visa. Italy, for UK nationals who reside in Italy prior to Brexit, they're required to register with their local authorities, and this must be submitted prior to Brexit. UK nationals relocating to Italy post-Brexit will need to obtain a full work permit and a full residence permit. And again, like with the French process, the Italian process can be quite lengthy. It can take months. And if the employer is registered on the fast track system in Italy, we are still looking at months rather than years to get a work permit. So the Italian process isn't as fast as a fast track might make you think. Just moving on to the Netherlands, UK nationals currently residing in the Netherlands are required to register with their local town hall. But following Brexit, following Brexit, what will happen is if they've already registered with a town hall pre-Brexit, then the town hall will send them a residence permit post-Brexit. So this application process will be a lot smoother if they're already in the Netherlands and they've registered with their local town hall. But post-Brexit, UK nationals who want to go to the Netherlands after post-Brexit will likely need to apply for a full work permit. Luckily, the Dutch process is slightly easier and slightly faster than the Italian and the French process. So it won't, it is more of an administrative burden, but not as much as the Italian or the French process. And moving on to Spain, the Spanish immigration work permit process is also quite cumbersome. So UK nationals who relocate to Spain must register with their local police station and obtain a certificate of registration. And the Spanish authorities have indicated that they will implement this process for a further 21 months transition period. But following Brexit, especially in a no-deal situation, UK nationals relocating to Spain will need to apply for a residence permit. So a full work and residence permit, which, like I said, is quite a cumbersome process with lots of documentation, lots of apostilling required from both the company and also the individual. But yes, that's a quick trip around Europe and what UK nationals need to do in Europe.
For sure. Thank you so much for highlighting some of this information. And that's going to bring us to the Q&A portion. I do realize that this webinar was originally booked for 45 minutes and we're gone over by a few. But I do want to take some time to Hannah ask a question or two, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So first question I have from our audience is, what happens if an EEA national comes to the UK before October 31st, but does not have a chance to apply for EU settlement scheme and then leaves the UK?
What they should do, if it's an EEA national, they can apply online, so via the app on their phone. So as soon as they know that they're going to be residing in the UK for more than 3 months, then I would urge them to submit their EU settlement scheme application using their phone, using the app. Do it as soon as you can and before you leave, because what will happen then is you will have an electronic copy, an electronic confirmation of your settlement scheme status.
Gotcha. Thank you. The next question is, can we ask for proof of their submission of the application for the settlement scheme?
Not really. If you're applying on using the app, then the app would show that you've submitted the application. And what you would generally do is you would take a screenshot of the app, save it in your phone, so that when you when you are going through immigration control, you would show the picture of your submission or your picture of your status to the immigration officer to show that you've got your EU settlement scheme permit. There's no hard copy of the permit, it's all on the app. And for non-EEA nationals, you won't get a response because confirming you have gotten you've submitted the application. I would simply keep a copy of the letter that they submit to the settlement scheme team to confirm that you have submitted the application.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I think that's where we're going to end the Q&A, because we are running a little bit over, and I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. So with that, Hannah, thank you so much for this very detailed presentation this morning or afternoon. Before we sign off, just any final closing remarks worth sharing?
Sorry, I was on mute for 2 seconds.
No worries.
I would just keep watching the news. Something's happening pretty much on a daily basis. And for HR professionals and immigration professionals, keep an eye. I would review your right to work process and keep in touch with your immigration provider for any updates, because there is something happening pretty much on a daily basis.
Gotcha. Yep. You can say that again. So with that, Hannah, thank you so much for this webinar. To all of our attendees, thank you so much for joining. And just as a final reminder, tomorrow you will receive links to download the recording, the slide deck. And within that email, you will also receive continuing education credits. So have a great rest of your day, and since it's a Thursday here in the US, have a great weekend. Thank you, everyone.